Hey everyone, it's Mark Woodling. I'm the director of Revenos's Institutional Investment Services, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about working with investors from our agents at EXP. So I have Ben Laube with me today, a super professional, successful, amazing agent, and just another one that we can all learn something from. So Ben is going to talk a little bit about how he's grown his business around working with investors in the Tampa and Central Florida or Orlando area. So Ben, welcome. You got 39 agents, a growing business. I can't say more about everything that you've been working on. So the fact that I worked with you with a client as well shows that, you know, we're not just buddies, but we're business partners. So anyways, love to hear from you and do a quick introduction, and let's talk investing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on. And it's, come full circle working together first and then now being at the same company. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So a little bit about us. We work with investors in the Central Florida, Tampa Bay area. And it really all started really from my youth. My parents exposed me to the investment cycle because they were buying long-term hold rentals growing up. And so that really sparked my interest in always being into the investing community. So when I got into real estate, that was my primary focus in the beginning. Just working with investors, I felt like they were a little bit more analytical, a little bit easier to deal with, less of an emotional roller coaster sometimes, and was able to build systems around managing those relationships and really kind of scaling that out. So.
Amazing. So you've lived it. That's probably one of my favorite things, that an investor-centric agent that has been an agent and an investor themselves, or just kind of have it in their blood, is already that much more advanced because they've played with their own money in some sense. There's no better way to learn than with your own money. So you have built a great business, and you know the reason how you and I have gotten to know each other was when I worked at my last company, Roofstock. I was in charge of their third-party agent network, and very much building that here within EXP, just for institutional investors, all the way down to property managers, private capital lenders, and then your everyday out-of-state investor, just fix and flipper. So you were getting a number of leads through Roofstock because we identified you as somebody that really understood how to scale up, right? You had your systems in place, you had your agents in place, and you had a full package where somebody like a Roofstock who said, hey, I have 20 listings. Is that going to break you? Like, tell me about your experience with taking on that kind of listing volume, and then how you built your team around to be able to manage something like that for some of these larger businesses and institutions.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we scaled our team rather quickly, because in November, we'll actually be celebrating 3 years, and now we have 39 agents. And so that growth just in 3 years is a short period of time. So a lot of the systems that we were putting in place to be able to just handle a larger agent base as a team is really what made the opportunity of just taking 20 listings on, overnight from an institutional investor not hugely frightening, but also like, okay, that's another step to test our systems and processes. And it all really started, I would say, from the beginning of getting my first virtual assistant as an independent agent and having to communicate to that person that I'm now delegating tasks to on how to do things to make my job as an independent agent more and more efficient. And I think, that foundation of starting there and building those processes and documenting and writing out how things are done, because that's the only way you can transfer information from one person to another person. In that case, it was me to my assistant, was key to start organizing, the ways we do things and the processes. And so over the last 3 years in launching the team, that was always my focus, was how can we keep our processes documented? It's, drilled into my staff's head, where if anything's changing or every single way that we do one thing has to be written down in some place, because, if, Susie hits by a bus, we have to know exactly what Susie did and how to step in her place. Or if she goes on vacation, right, we have to be able to handle that process. And that really led to the automation and the creation of processes around handling listings from when we go from getting that listing agreement signed and every single marketing step to getting that listing live, it made that process very, very narrow and organized. And since the process was built and there was, assistance involved in handling the admin and the nuances and the details of that process, it really made it easy to really just jump up and say, okay, yeah, we can totally do 20 listings overnight and work these listings through that process because it was already in place and already built.
Amazing. It's a conveyor belt, right? But
Mhm.
having the quality to be able to do it means process and training, and then process documentation, then more training, right? So I'm sure it never ends. Once you document one thing, you got to go back and check those documents and make sure everybody's up to speed on any little nuances or changes.
Absolutely. And it's about communicating those processes to everyone involved too, especially when you make a change.
Right. Exactly. Oh, exactly. Well, now I would like to go a little bit further into that. Now, working with investors is very systematic, right? They want speed, they want systems, they want the scalability. Those are the three S's I always focus in on. But that doesn't just happen in how you build your business. And then you can't just, promote yourself as being this like, institution friendly agent that others are like, oh, I understand what that means, right? So how do you present your business to others to really try to attract that type of volume, for whether it's a local investor that has their own portfolio, right? That knows that you can handle that kind of volume. How do you put yourself out there to stay in front of those client types that know that they're not going to break you, right? That you're going to be able to handle it with ease.
Like basically, we typically show our track record. So working with the number of listings that we have live at any given time and being able to understand or explain to them. So taking that, it's almost like taking that process that we've documented on how we're handling a listing and servicing our customers, so our SOPs, and then now taking that and modifying it to a marketing package, right? So this is our level of service when we get a listing agreement signed. We're gonna, take these next steps in either ordering photography. These are the types of photography packages we use. This is the lockbox. This is when it's going to be installed. This is the sign. This is when it's going to be installed. Who's going to install it? And then just taking all those steps that are almost like very technically written and then just converting it into a more of a marketing package is how we can detail it out to smaller investors and saying, okay, you have a listing. This is how we're going to flow through your process and handle your listing. And we just kind of describe that in a marketing sense. But with investors, investors always have a fun scenarios typically, right? Because you have the nuances of short-term investors who have a listing that they want to sell that have future bookings that are 6 to 12 months in advance, right, of when you're potentially going to close. So handling the future bookings is a whole different process that you don't have to deal with if you're just doing, a buy to sell residential transaction. Long-term investors can have a tenant in place, and there's so much more information that you have to gather about the tenant, the lease, when does their lease end, how is the security deposit held, where is it held, is there a property management company involved, how are you going to access the property for showings, or do you have to go through the PM, or can you reach out to the tenant directly? And so it's like the detailed orientedness is way higher when you're working with investors, because each of their cases is a little bit different, and for you to service their listing properly and not piss anyone off, you really got to make your notes detailed and know, okay, this investor is a duplex. One side is rented until the end of the year. The second side's rented now, right? Someone, an FHA buyer, could actually buy that property because the one of the leases ends in a month, and that tenant could be moved out and someone could occupy it, right? So there's nuances there, because even that kind of changes, how you market the property too, just based off of the tenant occupancy of the property. So that's the fascinating thing I like about investing and working with investors is there's always a different case of every situation is very, very different.
Sure. And so you remove the emotions, you remove some of the basic tasks, right, that you would have to go through with your typical seller that, is moving out of their maybe forever home, right? But to
Mhm.
me, what are your favorite things about working with investors, but what are also the harder aspects?
I think my favorite thing is like a real investor, like, okay, so your normal customer, right, not investor, is probably going to buy a house every 3 to 5 years, right? They really want to buy a house for 30 years, but no one keeps it for 30 years. So 3 to 5 years, 2 years if you're lucky, not so lucky if it's longer. But an investor, like an active investor, can be buying properties every quarter, right? So one good investor relationship could be 4 transactions a year, really depending on what they're doing, right? I mean, we had one investor load up on properties, purchase 6 properties in 1 year, and then changed his strategy, and within the following 2 years, offloaded 4 of them and bought another 5, right? And that was an individual investor, right? Just because his strategy changed. So that aspect of, there's so much more, I guess, money to be made when you're working with an investor, whether it's an individual investor or an institutional investor, because it's one relationship with multiple deals. But the hard part is some investors can be, very unrealistic with their returns that they want, right? They may be coming to your market and saying, this is the type of return that I want on my investment. And there's no product that's available for them to actually get that. So sometimes finding the right property for investors can take a much longer period of time. Or there's those wannabe investors who say they're investors, but you may have not qualified them properly. And you find out later they've actually never invested in a house and they don't know anything about the process, right? So they can be a whole lot of work.
And maybe we have you back on to do a deeper dive on that, because there's a lot of do's and don'ts. Yeah. It's probably one of the most important parts about how we spend our time, right? That's the top commodity that we all have, and we have to preserve it. But an investor can talk a big game and flash a lot of dollars around, but you do have to be very careful about, how you vet. So let's make a note and put that down for the next one, of just deep dive with Ben on that very topic. But what I want to get to in one of the final questions is around training. There is not a lot of really quality training on how to work with investors, right? And that's part of what I'm building with our institutional investment services group within the Revenues team. It's not just about driving leads. It's about creating certifications and training and meeting with agents like yourself. So if you had any training yourself, where to come from, or you have a big team of agents that are investor centric, or maybe they wanted to be, but then you kind of scared them away for the right reasons, because it does take a special type of agent. So maybe what's the training that you've had, and then what's the training that you give to some of these agents as they want to grow into this business?
I think we do a lot of training internally on our team, and most of it's like role playing and we talk about very specific situations of, okay, your investor said this, right? How do you answer it? How do you combat that? Mm-hmm. But I think everyone can relate in the sense that before you got your real estate license, you did know that there's a whole separate vocabulary for real estate, right? And then you go through this course and, you get your real estate license and you learn way too much law that you didn't even think you had to learn. And you understand the vocabulary of selling real estate transactions. Well, investing is a whole other set of vocabulary that you really need to learn to be able to really communicate with these investors and show that you understand what they're saying, or educate them and building credibility with them. So the biggest resource that I kind of push agents to from that regard, because if you want to work with investors, you either need to be an investor, or you should go where the investors are learning so that you know what they're learning and you can understand their language. And I think one of the biggest resources we always push out is Bigger Pockets, right? It's a wonderful resource of how you can learn different investment strategies as an agent that you can use. You can push your investors to it, and see what most investors are probably learning and following up about. But in our markets too, we're lucky enough to have local investor groups, which are great for networking purposes too. So they're always running classes and educations on how to become an investor. And like I said, you got to get the vocabulary right and understand how investors think and talk before you can truly service them to the high level.
It's fantastic. Yes, I couldn't agree anymore. Getting deep into the forums. I mean, you can get lost on one specific topic in about the state of Florida in general, right? You could say, let's go Florida. Let's talk about insurance and why it's going amok right now. And if you go to Bigger Pockets, there's going to be 20 people giving instead of just receiving information, they're giving. And so I agree with that. Once you get these agents that are really contributing, right? That's when you start getting phone calls and starting to generate even leads naturally or organically versus, having to pay, which they have a program for that as well.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that you cover the training yourself and you can give and maybe teach somebody through your own life experiences, or call it the hardships where you learn the hard way, but you're trying to help your agents kind of not have to learn the same direction. Well, if there's anything else I would love to hear about, it's just what's the number one thing that you would tell agents that want to work in this space, that maybe they're growing their business and want to take it to the next level by building systems, or they just want to learn about, what I think you just covered with Bigger Pockets. Like, what is that first thing that you should say is to do from a mindset perspective? Like, get focused, study. What would it be for you?
So I'll make it two things. One, if you don't have a virtual assistant, get a virtual assistant, because that's the only way you're going to document your processes to be able to streamline things. And then the second thing is start investing in the education behind investing, right? So whether that's reading books, Bigger Pockets, other podcasts, dive deep into the community of investors to learn how other people are doing it. Because first question an investor is going to ask you is, how many properties do you own as a realtor that are in your investment portfolio, right? Because they want to know if you've worked with investors before. And if you don't have your own investment properties, you got to show that you know what you're talking about enough that they're okay with that situation. So get the education and get the language.
That's fantastic. I love that. Well, Ben, I cannot thank you enough for just joining me and, giving more than you're receiving. I mean, that's the way it works, right? You got to give, and people are going to come to you and say, wow, Ben knows what he's talking about, or I want to learn more. So I really appreciate you coming on today and just giving me that insight in our agents. So next time we're going to go deeper on some other subjects, especially around qualification. So get ready, but thank you once again. And we will make sure that we stay in touch, both doing business together and, just doing some training.
Sounds good. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Ben. All right. And